Don't touch the luggage. Lena zipped up her suitcase with trembling hands. Her tiny rental apartment seemed even smaller than usual, with her hastily packed belongings standing in the middle of the room. She couldn't stay here anymore. The landlady had raised the rent, work was almost non-existent, and her son was going to school soon. Lena felt cornered. She took a deep breath, grabbed her suitcase by the handle and headed for the door. But when she reached for the handle, the door swung open on its own. A man stood on the threshold. Tall, stately in an expensive suit. Handsome but with a cold stare. Lena froze. "Don't touch the luggage," he said firmly. An unexpected meeting. Lena squeezed the handle of the suitcase. "Who are you?" The man took a step forward, filling the entire doorway. "My driver said you were going to leave." His voice was deep, confident. "Is that true?" "It's none of your business." She tried to step around him, but he blocked the way. "Oh, it does." The man crossed his arms over his chest. "Have you forgotten who owns this house?" Lena pressed her lips together. She hadn't forgotten. This apartment belonged to him. Alexander Orlov, a rich businessman, owner of a chain of elite real estate. He didn't know her personally, but she always knew who she was paying rent to. And now he was standing in front of her life. "An offer you can't refuse. You should have told me beforehand if you were going to move out," he said calmly, but there was something in his voice that sent a chill down her spine. "I have no choice," she whispered. Alexander looked at her carefully. "You have a son. Where will you go?" Lena looked away. She didn't know. To the train station? To someone she knew? To the street? Alexander understood everything without words. "Leave your things. I'll help you." Lena shook her head. "I don't need mercy," she answered quietly. But he stepped closer, looked into her eyes and said, "It's not a favor. It's an offer." "What's he up to?" Lena looked at him in bewilderment. "What kind of offer?" He ran his fingers over his chin thoughtfully, as if weighing something in his mind. "I need someone I can trust. It's not a difficult job, but it requires attention." "Work?" she interjected. Alexander nodded. "A housekeeper in one of my country houses. You will be provided with accommodation, a good salary and a place for your son." Lena opened her mouth but couldn't find the words. It was too good to be true. "Why me?" Alexander hesitated for a moment, then said quietly, "Because I know what it means to lose a family." Lena felt something tremble in her soul. She looked at the suitcase. And then she looked at it again. And realized that her life had just changed. For a new beginning. Lena didn't answer right away. She looked at Alexander, trying to understand why a rich and powerful man suddenly decided to help her. But there was no pity in his eyes. Only seriousness and firmness. She looked at the suitcase, at her son, who was peering fearfully out from behind the door, and then back at him. "Good," she whispered. Alexander nodded. "Pack your bags. The driver will take you." An unusual house. An hour later, Lena and her son were already approaching the country mansion. It was not just a dwelling. A beautiful two-story house with huge windows, surrounded by greenery. Everything looked as if they were in another world. Lena squeezed her son's palm as they stepped inside. "Is this where we are going to live?" the boy asked in a whisper. "Yes," Lena answered quietly, looking around. Alexander led them inside. "You can take the room upstairs," he said calmly. "From tomorrow you will start working." Lena nodded. She didn't understand why he had done this for her. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Strange master. The next days passed in an unusual bustle. Lena tried not to ask questions and just did her job, looked after the house, kept order. Alexander was rarely here, but when he appeared, he was always alone. No guests, no family. He often went to the terrace, sat for long periods of time with a glass of wine, silently looking into the distance. One day Lena dared to ask, "Why are you here alone?" Alexander looked up at her. "Because it's easier for me." She nodded but did not believe it. The mystery of the past. After a few weeks, trust developed between them. Lena was no longer afraid of him, and Alexander stayed home more and more often. One evening they were sitting in the kitchen, drinking tea. Why did you decide to help me? Lena finally asked. Alexander took a sip and looked at her. I once had a family, he said quietly. But I lost them because of my pride. Lena held her breath. I couldn't bring back the past, he continued. But when I saw you, I realized I could still help someone not lose their future. She stared at him, and in that moment there was something more than gratitude between them. Something that was frightening, and something that gave hope. Lena looked at Alexander carefully. He rarely talked about himself, but now, it seemed, he decided to make an exception. He slowly put the cup of tea on the table and, without looking at her, spoke quietly. I was married, Victoria, and I met when I was just starting to build a business. I had no fortune or power then, just dreams and ambition. Lena listened in silence. She was not from my world at all, Alexander grinned. The daughter of rich parents, accustomed to luxury. But that didn't stop her. She loved me for who I was. He was silent for a second, as if gathering his thoughts. When the business started to grow, everything changed, he continued. I became obsessed with work. Constant deals, negotiations, projects. I thought I was doing the right thing because I was making money for us. But before I knew it, I was no longer the man she fell in love with. He ran his hand over his face, as if erasing invisible memories. Victoria often said I was becoming different. A stranger. I'd wave it off, saying she just needed to be patient. But she couldn't? Lena asked cautiously. Alexander grinned bitterly. Oh, she tried to save us. But at some point I began to love my job more than her. Lena felt something squeeze inside. She left? Alexander nodded. Yes. I came home one day and her things were gone. She left only a note. You lost me. I hope it was worth it. There was silence in the room. Lena noticed his fingers gripping the edge of the table. That was the first time I realized what it meant to be truly alone. Did you try to get her back? Lena asked. Alexander smiled sadly. Of course. But it was too late. She had already started a new life. Without me. Lena looked at him. She suddenly felt sorry for him. This man, whom everyone saw as successful, confident, unattainable, was actually broken from the inside. Do you still love her? Alexander looked at her. Sometimes I think I do. Sometimes, that I just love the memories of her. He paused. But one thing I realized for sure. If you are given a chance to be happy, you can't miss it. Lena felt her heart race. Those words had been said for a reason. But was she ready to hear them for real? Lena tells her story. Alexander was silent for a long time after his words, looking at the cup in his hands. It seemed he hadn't expected to say it all out loud. Lena took a deep breath. Now it was her turn. She'd carried her pain inside for a long time, but for the first time there was someone around to whom she wanted to tell the truth. You're not the only one who lost family, she said quietly. Alexander looked up at her. Lena wrapped her fingers around the mug as if trying to warm herself. Looked, very much. And I thought I was loved in return. She was silent, searching for words. Artyom and I met when I was 19. He was my first in everything. Handsome, smart, charming. With him I felt protected. Lena grinned, but there was no joy in her voice. When I got pregnant, he was happy at first. Said we could handle it. I believed him. She pressed her lips together. But the more my belly grew, the farther away he got. Alexander listened attentively, without interrupting. When I gave birth, he didn't even come to the hospital. Said he had important things to do. She took a deep breath. A week later, I found out he'd gone off to someone else. Silence. Alexander frowned, but said nothing. I was left alone. No support, no money, with a tiny son in my arms. Her voice shook, but she quickly pulled herself together. I had to learn to survive. I had to work nights, sleep for 2 hours, eat what was left after the baby. Lena looked out the window. But I don't regret it. Not for a second. I have a son. He's the best thing that happened to me. She looked at Alexander again. But after Artyom, I don't trust anyone. Alexander looked at her for a long time, then said slowly, he was an idiot. Lena grinned. Thank you. That's a useful observation. He shook his head. No, I mean it. You're the strong one. You made it. She smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. And you? Did you? Alexander looked at her as if he didn't know the answer himself. Perhaps I'm just now beginning to. And in that silence, they suddenly understood each other. Understood the pain. They understood the loss. And realized that maybe they weren't as alone as they had seemed before. What happened next? After that night, something changed between them. They were no longer just two people who happened to be under the same roof. Now they were bound together by the past, by pain and understanding. Alexander began to stay home more often. He no longer seemed withdrawn like he used to. Sometimes Lena caught his gaze, full of incomprehensible longing, but he quickly looked away. He also began to notice little things. The way Lena fixed her hair when she was worried. How she always feeds her son first and then eats herself. How, despite being tired, she never complained. And that worried him. One evening Alexander again lingered in the kitchen. Lena was preparing dinner, and he silently watched as she deftly cut vegetables. Lena, he suddenly said. She turned around. Yes? Alexander opened his mouth, but kept silent. He didn't know what he wanted to say. He understood one thing. He had no right to get attached to her. She had already been betrayed by a man once. He couldn't afford to do it again. But every day it became harder and harder for him to resist. The next day he left on business, and when he returned, he saw Lena playing with her son in the yard. She was laughing. Genuinely, sincerely. And suddenly he caught himself thinking that he hadn't heard that sound in his house for a long time. Lena, he called again. She raised her head. I have an important dinner with the partners tomorrow. Could you keep me company? Lena blinked in surprise. What do you mean? Literally. Just dinner. She looked at him suspiciously. This is a date? Alexander grinned. Oh, just a pleasant evening. But even he himself didn't believe those words. Lena bit her lip, then nodded. And at that moment he realized he'd made a mistake. Because this wasn't just dinner. And it wasn't just pleasant company. He knew he was going too far. But he couldn't stop now. Lena stood in front of the mirror for a long time, deciding what to wear. It was just a dinner. It's just a meeting. She sighed. But when Alexander pulled up behind her, she saw something new in his gaze. Something that hadn't been there before. They arrived at an upscale restaurant in the center of town. Live jazz, dimmed lights, waiters in perfectly pressed suits. Lena felt out of place, but Alexander seemed perfectly calm. Relax, he whispered, pulling up a chair for her. She clutched the wine glass and nodded. I'm just not used to this. Alexander looked at her carefully. Used to what? She grinned. To having someone take care of me. He didn't say anything, but his gaze softened. The evening passed surprisingly easily. They talked about the past, about life, about things they had never even discussed before. Lena suddenly realized that she felt good. That there was something warm in this man, despite his cold mask. When dinner was over, Alexander walked her to her car. Did you like it? He asked. Lena nodded. Yes. It was pleasant. A tense silence hung between them. Alexander looked at her. Lena. She froze. He took a step closer. Too close. She felt his warmth, heard his breath. This isn't right, she whispered. Alexander ran his fingers along her cheek. I know. But despite that, he still leaned over and kissed her. And Lena realized it was too late to stop herself. Lena felt her heart pounding frantically in her chest. She should have pulled away. Should have said it was a mistake. But instead she responded to his kiss. Alexander slowly pulled her closer, his hands holding her waist tightly. Lena, he whispered between kisses, as if he wanted to say something but changed his mind. She didn't let him finish. She didn't need any more words. They didn't remember how they'd gotten to his house. Just a second ago they had been by the car, and now they were standing in his spacious living room, looking at each other. Lena was breathing heavily, her cheeks flaming. Alexander looked at her in a way no one had ever looked at her before. You can leave if you want, he said quietly, but there was too much desire in his voice. Lena took a step forward. I'm not leaving. He didn't hold back any longer. Alexander slowly ran his fingers down her back, his touch both gentle and demanding. Lena closed her eyes, savoring his warmth, his scent, his presence. Every touch, every kiss erased the boundaries between them. They forgot about everything. The past. The fears. There was only this moment. Just the two of them. Silence. Only their breathing and the beats of their hearts echoing in their ears. Lena looked at Alexander, his gaze serious, intense. "Are you sure?" He whispered, running his fingers along her cheek. She could have left. But she didn't want to. Every movement he made was sure, but gentle. It was as if he was afraid to scare her away, to give her a chance to change her mind. But Lena didn't change her mind. She ran her fingers over his shoulders, memorizing everything, the texture of his skin, his silhouette, his scent. It wasn't just desire. It was more than that. They belonged only to each other. Lena felt his strength, but also his caution. Every touch, every kiss spoke more than words. They melted into the night. When it was over, Lena lay beside him, listening to his steady breathing. Alexander ran his fingers down her arm, lightly squeezing her fingers in his. "I didn't think this would happen," he admitted quietly. She smiled without opening her eyes. "Neither did I. But deep down, I knew there was no turning back." That night had changed everything. Lena woke up to soft sunlight streaming through the curtains. For a moment she didn't realize where she was. But then she felt a warm hand on her waist and remembered everything. Alexander, his touch. This night. She turned around carefully. He was still asleep, his breathing even, his features relaxed. She'd never seen him like this before, unmasked as a cold, calculating man. She smiled. But then her heart clenched. When Lena carefully slipped out of bed and dressed. She didn't know how to behave after this. She wanted to run away, to pretend that nothing had happened. But then she heard his voice. "Are you going to leave without saying goodbye?" She froze. Alexander was no longer asleep. He was lying propped up on his elbow, staring at her. She stammered, not knowing what to say. He was silent, but there was a question in his eyes. We didn't promise each other anything, did we?" She tried to say discreetly. Alexander frowned. "Is that what you want? To pretend it never happened?" Lena looked away. "I just don't know what's going to happen now." He stood up, stepping closer. "Lena," his voice became softer. "We can make our own rules." She grinned. "And you know how to play by other people's rules?" He thought for a second. "No," he admitted honestly. "But for your sake, I'm willing to try." She looked at him. Suddenly I realized that he was serious. His gaze was confident, but warm. She could have left. But for some reason she didn't want to. Lena stared at Alexander, her heart beating too fast. His words sounded too good to be true. She knew who he was, used to controlling everything, not tolerating weakness. And now he was saying he was willing to play by her rules? "Are you sure?" She asked quietly, not moving from her seat. He moved closer, his gaze serious. "Sure of what? That I want you by my side?" She swallowed. "It's just emotion. You said yourself you didn't expect this." Alexander squinted his eyes. "You think I don't know how to sort out my desires?" He ran his fingers over her wrist, making her skin flare at the touch. "I know what I want, Lena." She didn't know what to say. Her mind said run. But her heart whispered to stay. "Okay," she breathed out. "Let's see how ready you are for someone else's rules." Alexander grinned slightly. "We'll see." And in that moment, something changed between them. This night was no longer just a fluke. Now it was a game where the stakes were too high. And neither of them was going to lose. Lena stayed. But in the morning it was more complicated than she expected. Alexander acted as if nothing had changed. As if he was used to her presence as something natural. He offered her coffee, calmly discussed some business, but never once spoke about last night. And that confused her. "Do you always do this?" she asked as they sat in the kitchen. Alexander glanced at her over his cup. "Like this?" Acting as if nothing had happened. She grinned. "I just don't want to pressure you, Lena." She didn't know whether to be pleased or annoyed by that. But one thing she realized for sure, he wasn't the kind of man to reveal all his cards at once. "I'll take you home," he said, glancing at his watch. Lena nodded, though something inside her clenched. He hadn't asked her to stay. Didn't say he wanted to see her again. It was as if everything depended on her now. But as they left the house and headed for the car, Alexander suddenly stopped. "Lena." She turned around. "What?" He looked at her for a long, hard look. And then he said, "I'm having a big dinner tonight. There will be a lot of people. Partners, investors." She frowned. Alexander took a step closer. "I want you there. With me." Her heart skipped a beat. "As what?" He didn't answer right away. Then, smiling with the corners of his lips, he whispered, "As the only woman who occupies my thoughts right now." Lena didn't know what to say. But deep down she realized, she had already made her choice. Lena stood in front of the mirror, nervously adjusting her dress. She couldn't believe that she had agreed to this dinner. A luxurious restaurant, Alexander's partners, influential people. She was among them. "Lena, ready?" She flinched at the sound of his voice. Alexander stood in the doorway, scrutinizing her. His gaze was warm, but studying, as if he was assessing not only her appearance, but her emotions as well. "You look amazing," he said calmly. Lena sighed. "I hope I behave accordingly." He grinned. "Just be yourself." When they entered the restaurant, Lena immediately felt the tension. They drew attention. Alexander had never brought women with him. The whispers. The stares. Lena felt out of place. But Alexander, as always, remained calm and confident. "Relax," he said quietly, lightly squeezing her palm under the table. She took a deep breath. Just then, a woman approached their table. Tall, elegant, with a perfect smile. Lena immediately realized it was someone from Alexander's past. "Alexander," her voice was soft, but in her eyes there was a challenge. "I didn't expect to see you with someone." She glanced at Lena, but immediately looked at him again. "I didn't expect you to show up at all," he replied calmly. Lena felt the tension in the air. Alexander had been holding her hand, but now his fingers clenched tighter. She looked at him, and suddenly realized something was happening, something he hadn't told her about. Lena could feel the tension thickening around her. Whoever she was, kept her eyes on Alexander. She clearly wanted to say something, but hesitated as if choosing the right words. "Have you forgotten me so quickly?" she finally said with a slight chuckle. Alexander remained as calm as ever. "I think this is not the place to remember the past." Lena froze. He hadn't said this past didn't exist. She could feel the anxiety rising in her chest. "Who is she?" "The woman he loved? Would you introduce me?" the stranger asked with a smile, shifting her gaze to Lena. Alexander paused for a moment, then reluctantly said, "Lena, this is Victoria." Victoria. The name sounded cold and detached, but there was something more in Alexander's voice. And in Victoria's eyes, triumph. "Nice to meet you, Lena," she said with artificial warmth. "I hope you know who you're dealing with." Lena pressed her lips together. Alexander suddenly tensed. "Victoria, that's enough." But she only grinned. "Oh, I didn't say anything like that, did I?" She cast one last glance at Lena and walked away, leaving a trail of tense silence behind her. Lena looked at Alexander. "Who is she?" He clenched his fingers into a fist. "No one you need to worry about." "Really?" she asked quietly. "Then why did she act like she had a right to you?" Alexander fell silent. For the first time, he didn't know what to say. Lena felt a prick of pain. Something told her, this evening would change everything. Lena looked away, feeling anxiety rising in her chest. Alexander had always seemed like a man without weaknesses, but now... He looked confused now. Like he didn't know what to do. "Lena," his voice was quiet, but she raised her hand sharply, stopping him. "You do realize I'm not stupid, right?" She looked straight into his eyes. "This woman wasn't just a part of your past." He hesitated for a moment. "It's complicated." "So you're hiding something after all." Her lips twitched in a bitter smile. He closed his eyes, then took a deep breath. "But I'll tell you." Victoria was my fiancée. Lena felt her heart skip a beat. But she remained silent, letting him continue. It was a long time ago, before I was what I am now. We were going to get married, but she left. Left? Lena frowned. But Alexander pressed his lips together, as if struggling with a memory. She had someone else. I found out a week before the wedding. Lena went numb. And now she's back? Alexander nodded. I think she's in trouble. She always comes when she needs something. Lena wondered. So this woman had ruined him once. And now she's back as if nothing had happened. Do you still feel something for her? Her voice sounded quieter than she wanted it to. Alexander looked at her sharply. Oh. But Lena wasn't sure. What if this meeting had stirred up the past? What if Alexander hadn't fully let her go? The questions plagued her. And now she didn't know if she could trust him. Lena tried to figure out if he felt something for Victoria. But there was only weariness in Alexander's eyes. I'm not going back in time, he said firmly. Victoria is a closed chapter. Lena nodded, but something inside wouldn't let go. Did she trust Alexander? Not completely. And Victoria didn't seem like she was going to disappear. Late that night, just as Lena was about to leave, Alexander's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen and his face changed. Lena immediately realized it was her. Are you going to answer it? Lena asked. Alexander hesitated. But after a few seconds, the phone vibrated again. Lena watched silently as he gritted his teeth. She's not going to let up that easily, is she? He ran his hand over his face. I'll deal with it. What? Her voice trembled. He met her gaze. Tomorrow. The meeting that would decide everything. The next morning, Alexander met with Victoria after all. Lena didn't know what they talked about, but she saw him come back angry and silent. Is everything all right? She asked cautiously. Alexander clenched his fists. She wants to go back. Lena froze. And what did you tell her? He looked at her, his gaze intense. That I already have another woman. Lena felt something warm spill into her chest. Are you sure? Alexander stepped closer. I'm more sure of that than of anything else. But Lena knew it wasn't over. Victoria wasn't the type to give up. Lena tried to believe that Victoria wouldn't be a problem anymore. But her gut told her otherwise. And she was right. A few days later, when she and Alexander were about to have dinner at home, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Are you expecting someone? Lena asked warily. Alexander frowned. He opened the door, and on the threshold stood Victoria. She had an envelope in her hands. We need to talk. Victoria's voice was confident but cold. Alexander tensed. I told you it's over between us. Victoria tilted her head. Is that what you think? Then explain this. She held out an envelope. Alexander snatched it sharply and opened it. Lena saw his face go pale. What is it? Lena asked quietly, not realizing what was happening. But when she looked into the envelope, her heart squeezed. Inside were photographs. They showed Alexander and Victoria a year ago. Some were of them kissing. Others showed them cuddling in a hotel room. Lena felt the world around her crumble. She looked at Alexander. Is it true? He muffled a muted curse, clenching the photos in his fist. It was a long time ago, Lena. Before you. But Victoria only grinned. Are you sure? She pulled out another photograph. It was of herself, with a rounded belly. Congratulations, Alexander, Victoria whispered. You're going to be a father. Lena inhaled sharply. Alexander turned pale. And Victoria smiled, enjoying their reactions. So, darling, she turned to Lena, are you still sure he belongs to you? Lena felt her chest tighten with pain. She looked at Alexander, but his face was blank. It was as if he didn't know what to feel himself. It can't be true, he finally squeezed out. Victoria shrugged. Are you sure? She ran her hand slowly over her stomach. If you want, you can see for yourself. Lena couldn't listen to this anymore. I need to go out. She turned toward the door, but Alexander grabbed her arm. Lena, she looked into his eyes, but saw no answers. What, you want me to stay and listen to you discuss your child with her? Alexander swallowed hard. I didn't know myself. But now you do. Lena pulled her hand away. And now you have someone to take care of. She walked out, slamming the door, and Victoria's voice sounded behind her. It seems you're going to have to make a choice, Sasha. Lena walked down the street, not realizing where she was going. Her thoughts were getting confused. He said Victoria is in the past, but he has a child with her. How could she believe him after that? The phone vibrated. Alexander called. A second time, but she didn't answer. This time let him decide for himself what was more important to him. Alexander stood in silence, listening as the door slammed shut behind Lena. Victoria crossed her arms smugly. So, glad I came? Alexander clenched his jaw. Are you sure this baby is mine? She grinned. You're insulting me. Of course I am. He didn't trust her. But if it was true, he couldn't just turn away. I'll do a paternity test, he said in a flat voice. Victoria shrugged. Whatever you say. But even without the test, you've already lost everything, haven't you? Alexander flared up with anger. Get out. What, you've already kicked Lena out, now me? She snorted. But I'm in no hurry. Victoria left, leaving a heavy smell of expensive perfume. Alexander grabbed his phone and dialed Lena again. But she didn't answer. Lena sat in the park with her arms wrapped around herself. Her phone vibrated nonstop. Alexander? She couldn't talk to him now. If he's having a baby, he should be with Victoria. That's right. But then why did everything hurt inside? Suddenly the phone stopped ringing. And then a second later, a text came through. Lena, I'm not letting you go. Wait for me. Please. She clutched the phone in her hands. Alexander wanted her back. But could she trust him again? She didn't know yet. Lena sat on the bench, staring into the screen of her phone. A message from Alexander burned before her eyes. Lena, I'm not letting you go. Wait for me. Please. She sighed heavily, tucked her phone into her pocket, and closed her eyes. You look like the whole world has collapsed. A calm voice sounded nearby. Lena raised her head and saw Igor, an old friend. May I? He nodded at the empty seat next to her. She just shrugged her shoulders. Igor sat down and looked at her carefully. Do you want to tell me what happened? Lena hesitated. It's complicated. Everything in life is complicated, he answered calmly. But you know, sometimes talking helps. She took a deep breath and made up her mind. And she told him everything. So he could have a child? Igor clarified when she had finished. Lena nodded. And you think he should stay with Victoria? Don't you? She asked tiredly. He should be there for his child, Igor agreed. But that doesn't mean he should be with Victoria. Lena stared silently at the ground. Do you love him? She covered her eyes. Then why are you running? Lena grinned bitterly. Because I'm not sure I can trust him again. Igor sighed. Then you need to check it out. She glanced at him. How? Not by running away. And wait to see what he does. That same night, when Lena got home, a call from Alexander was waiting for her again. She looked at the screen, then finally pressed answer. Lena, his voice was tired but confident. I want to see you. I don't know, Alexander. Please. I'll explain everything. She clutched the phone in her hand. Everything inside her said don't do it. But she agreed. And the next morning they met again. Lena came to the cafe before the appointed time. Her hands were shaking, her heart was beating fast. What if he lies again? What if he really loves Victoria? What if he doesn't need me anymore? She was sitting at a table by the window, immersed in her thoughts, when the door swung open. Alexander. There was weariness in his eyes, but determination in his gaze. He sat down across from her and was silent for a few seconds. Then he took her hands in his. Thank you for coming. His voice was deep, a little hoarse. Lena took her hands away and crossed them on her chest. Speak. Alexander took a deep breath. I've done the paternity test. Lena froze. He looked her straight in the eye. The baby is not mine. Silence. Lena couldn't immediately grasp the meaning of the words. What? Victoria lied. His voice became firm. She wanted me back and decided to use the baby to tie me to her. Lena froze. Are you sure? Alexander pulled out his phone, opened the letter with the test results and showed her. Paternity probability, 0%. Lena stared at the screen. She was shaking. Had she just lied? Alexander nodded. Yes. Lena sobbed. She'd agonized for so many days, told herself so many times that he should be with Victoria, and it was a lie. She felt her shoulders shudder. Alexander instantly moved forward. Lena, but she raised her hand, stopping him. Why didn't you check right away? Her voice was quiet but tense. Why did you let me leave? Alexander clenched his fists. Because I was in shock. Because I was afraid it was true. He closed his eyes and exhaled heavily. And because I didn't know you'd believe me. Lena stared at him in silence. Anger. Disappointment. But also a sense of relief. He didn't betray me. He didn't lie. But can I trust him again? Alexander seemed to read her thoughts. He reached for her hand and gently covered her palm with his. Lena, his voice sounded honest. I love only you. She held her breath. He looked into her eyes and there was so much emotion in that look. Let me make it right. Lena didn't know what to say back. But deep down she felt that her heart had already made a choice. Lena looked away, trying to comprehend everything she had just heard. He didn't betray me. He's not the father of this child. But can I trust him again? Alexander didn't take his gaze off her. Lena, he repeated, his voice sounding soft but insistent. Let me make this right. She took a deep breath. I don't know, she admitted honestly. I need time. Her words caught him, but he only nodded. Take as much as you need, he said quietly. He didn't push, didn't try to force her to make a decision right now. And that was what Lena appreciated the most. After the meeting, she wandered the streets for a long time, thinking about everything. Part of her wanted to throw herself into his arms right away. But the other part was afraid. What if he disappointed her again? What if something would come along that would ruin everything again? And yet, I love only you. Those words wouldn't leave her head. The next day Alexander didn't call, didn't write. He was really giving her time. But Lena felt drawn to him. And then she made up her mind. She approached his house in the late afternoon. Her hands were shaking, her heart was pounding at a frantic pace. She pressed the bell. A couple seconds later, the door opened. Alexander stood in front of her, surprised, but with hope in his eyes. Lena, she took a deep breath. I came because... She hesitated, not knowing the right way to say it. But Alexander understood. He stepped forward, took her hand gently. Are you sure? His voice sounded reserved, but there was hope in his eyes. Lena nodded. Yes. Alexander didn't ask anything else. He just pulled her to him and hugged her tightly. And at that moment Lena realized that she was finally back where she really belonged.